trygt.
Right. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for watching today. This is the second live session with questions and answers, which is a part of the course, and we're looking forward to the next 1.5 hours. We've received a lot of questions, so we probably just should get on with it.
Yep. So, yes, thank you, Jakob. Hello, everybody. As Jakob said, we will be going through the questions that you've sent in beforehand, and then we also hope that some of you watching us live right now will ask us some questions. But let's just jump right into it. The first question is from Wendy Findlay. She writes, I have wondered after the tales we have studied whether there is also an underlying theme covering politics. As in our first comparison tales, the overthrow of a crown happens with death of king and advisors, but in Little Mermaid could not at first glance see a political link, though mention is made of an arranged marriage. So is this the political link? And it's an interesting question because it's also a question of how much Andersen references the political context that he is living in the 19th century Denmark. And if I should just start that one off, I would say that it's true that especially in the fairy tales, you don't find a lot of references, I would say, to historical political events in Denmark, and I think it's difficult to read them as direct commentaries on political events, and that has to do with, I think, quite a lot of things. First of all, the fairy tale form takes on this kind of I don't know, even though it's historically situated, it takes on this kind of more abstract form, I think. So it's not very suited to direct political commentaries, I would say. It's more some kind of general or larger questions that these fairy tales take up or deliberate upon. Having said that, there is, of course, some political themes in some of these fairy tales. I think the most used one and the most political one is maybe The Emperor's New Clothes, which is generally viewed as some kind of critique of the ones in power and the vanity of the ones in power. But it's still on a very generalized kind of level. So it could be any kind of king, any kind of power, any kind of corrupt system or vain system. So I wouldn't say that there are any direct thematizations, which can also has to do with the fact that when Hans Christian Andersen starts writing his fairy tales, art in Denmark has, for a couple of decades, I believe, been under quite heavy scrutiny, and artists have been discouraged from thematizing directly on political events. After the French Revolution, I believe the king in Denmark made quite a hard censorship on art and philosophy, that it should not agitate, it should not instigate any kind of political program or anything like that. So I think that the art world in Denmark had been used to, for a couple of decades, to be more discreet when talking about politics and political subjects. I don't know if you agree.
I agree completely, and I think that I mean, Andersen does reflect on the fact that by means of genres like the fairy tale, the fable, one can be able to, so to speak, tell the truth without offending anybody.
Yeah.
So I think that's a strategy indeed, and Andersen is rarely overtly political. But just to say a few words about The Little Mermaid, I think you can also see some social satire in this story. The depiction of the merfolk as, you know, the bourgeois elite. How many oysters you can wear on your tail will define your rank in the hierarchy, and the meaning of life is having a ball and so on.
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
yeah. So I think we should move on to the next question from Daphne Schubert. She asks, what can you tell us about Andersen's religious beliefs? How much did they change during his life? At times he sounds almost childlike in his thinking, as if traditional Christian belief came easily to him. At other times, though, his views appear more complex, maybe even pre-Christian, for example, regarding the afterlife. Do you think his sometimes ambiguous view of religion connects to personal or social challenges in his life? Or is it simply a reflection on the intellectual debates of his age, for example, regarding the relative merits of reason and imagination? Well, I would say both. I think Andersen's belief kind of changed throughout his life. I don't think he was ever fixed upon any specific belief set. He was Christian, but not very orthodox. And I think he was always searching and asking questions when it comes to religion and Christian faith. He was very open-minded. His father was a free thinker, and I think he was influenced by that. So his curiosity about religion, I think, it was personal and also intellectual.
Yep,
so,
I think
and
so
we'll return to the question of Andersen's religion, because we've received a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, for some reason that's one of the things that really interests people. Yeah, I agree with you, and he was very personally invested in these intellectual debates of this time, and was in dialogue with some of the most important people in those debates. So there's no clear way of making a clear cut between his personal life and the intellectual debates of this age, because he was very invested in them.
And the childlike, which I think is right, but that can also be a kind of mask that he's wearing. Yeah, in certain tales. Yeah, where such a mask will fit in, so to speak.
Yes, he can use it artistically, strategically, this childlikeness. We will also return to that, but we must also remember that Christianity in general, especially in the I think especially in the Reformed countries of Europe, were in some kind of crisis during this entire century.
Yeah.
So Andersen is not exactly an exception with this very, very questioning, very open way of dealing with Christian issues. It wasn't just him who was in some sort of personal ambiguity, but it was actually Christianity in Denmark in general was in some kind of crisis.
So yeah, I think we should move on.
Yes.
Because
it's from Tom Dussman, the next question. It says, The Little Mermaid seems very much a combination of the Old Testament and the New. The first parts of the story describe an Eden-like paradise under the sea. The forbidden fruit is the idea that merfolk can never have a human soul unless one goes to a certain witch serpent. The last part of The Little Mermaid is a story of the trials of leaving the garden, pain, suffering, and death, and resurrection and salvation. Was this an overt Christian morality story, such as The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And if I should just, it's an interesting analysis of The Little Mermaid, seeing it as kind of this combination of the Old Testament and the New. I don't think, however, that it was an overt Christian morality story necessarily. The Christian theme is definitely there, but I don't know if you can say that there is a clear-cut Christian moral to draw from it, especially because the ending is so difficult when it comes to at least Lutheran, I would say Lutheran Protestant Christianity, because it ends in this sort of limbo state that does not seem to be proper Christianity or proper Lutheranism somehow.
No, because you could say Old Testament, New Testament. I think that's certainly true, but also in a way Catholicism and Lutheranism. So I think again Andersen is asking questions as regards different belief systems. One should also, or one could be aware that a lot of ideas about the afterlife circulated at this moment in time. Some of them were highly unorthodox. One is called an idea about an in-between state, which is a kind of purgatory state, but not a Catholic one. But it is one where the soul, at the moment of death, has not reached perfection, and the soul will have to reach perfection before it can enter heaven or whatever. So there's a kind of prolonged education of the soul after death.
Yeah.
And some people think that it's an idea like that which is kind of mirrored in the ending of The Little Mermaid. So it's very open to different interpretations.
And this wasn't necessarily some discussions that only went on in occult for us. It was actually priests and theologians of the time that were participating in these debates.
Yeah.
We could also mention that one of Andersen's, you could call it idols, or who becomes one of his friends, is the priest Ingemann, or vicar Ingemann, who he would also send parts of his texts and who would comment on his texts. And if Ingemann saw something that he thought was directly unchristian or in some way or other way very problematic, he would say so. And maybe sometimes Andersen would make revisions and sometimes he wouldn't. But it's just to say that this wasn't these completely far out heretical deliberations. This was actually an open debate about this in between state of the soul.
Yeah, Ingemann was also a writer.
Yeah,
and he wrote historical novels. He wrote fairy tales and fantastic tales, and his tales are maybe more straightforward Christian allegories or moral stories. I think Andersen's tales are much more open, in fact.
Definitely. There are also several instances, I've just come across a few where Ingemann actually tells him that this seems unchristian, and where he doesn't really changes a lot after that, because it's the way he intended it to be.
Yes.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next one. It's from Laila Barker. I'm gathering from the past analysis that Andersen did have strong links to Christianity. In your opinion, did his personal faith play a big role in his inability to have a lasting romantic relationship? Much of your interpretations touch on sexual themes, and I'm undecided if this is due to Andersen's awkwardness with other people, or something idealized within himself which could never bear fruit. Also, is there a clear-cut line between the fairy tales and fables and the realm of fiction? The mother seems to deviate from a fairy tale by teaching us that one's choices can have great effect upon another's life, so be careful what you wish for. Well, to begin with the latter part of this question, I think what Andersen is doing is slightly blurring the distinction between fairy tale and fable. It's part of his working on and twisting these very old genres. I think the main distinction you can make is that a fairy tale does not have a moral, whereas a fable does have a moral. And this is kind of blurred with many of Andersen's stories. The story of a mother is a good example. He will also write quite a few short fable-like stories, especially in the latter part of his authorship, where you do get a moral, but where it is a mock one.
Yes, yeah. And where he's really challenging the fable as a genre that can teach us anything. Because in an uncertain world, which is the world of modernity, you they seemed outdated. Some of these ancient genres, like the fable. So you can't really say anything as certain about the world in such an uncertain world, and that you could say that he actually makes a point out of that by using the fable genre and challenging it.
Yeah. And then about whether Andersen's personal faith was kind of in the way when it comes to having a lasting romantic relationship. I'm not sure. I think it's difficult to answer such a question, but I don't think it's had much to do with his personal belief.
No,
But
I don't.
Other sides of his character, and maybe also the predicament of a writer who wants to have a lot of time to write. Yeah.
I understand where the question is coming from, because when we go through these fairy tales, we might give off the impression that Andersen was particularly pious. And I don't necessarily think that's true. He was religious, of course, and he was very interested in religious matters. But I don't think that he necessarily in his own personal life was extremely pious. He was inhibited by a lot of things, but not necessarily Christianity. And his religion wouldn't have been in some sort of conflict with necessarily with a love life. So I'm not sure that is the case. It would have been perfectly okay in a Christian setting.
And then Linda Bella asks, did Andersen state that there were sexual themes in his tales and original stories?
Yeah.
And I think the short version will be no, he didn't state that.
No.
I don't think many writers at this specific time in history would state that.
No.
Even if it was the case. No.
You have to remember that these writers were writing for a kind of uptight bourgeois society. And they were even very critical towards the literature of the century before. We have a great Danish-Norwegian playwright called Holberg, and he was hugely popular in the 18th century, but all of a sudden he's not very popular anymore in the 19th century because his characters were considered crude and a bit too uncouth. So this is really bourgeois society, and you had to be very discreet about issues like sexuality and sexual themes. So it's very downplayed.
Yeah. And then we've received a question just now from Coco Chanel. Does ring a bell, doesn't it? How does Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales affect the traditional folk tales that he based his stories on? Well, I guess we would have to say that I don't think they influenced them back in any way.
No.
Because these folk tales, of course, they existed for centuries and centuries, and they were written down at this time in Denmark, in Germany, in Norway. Certain people like the Grimm brothers would collect them, write them down, perhaps sanitize them to a degree. But the oral folktale tradition would not be affected by this literary phenomenon.
No,
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either.
Neither by people like Andersen writing in the mold of the folktale artistically. No.
No, I don't think either. It doesn't go back and forth like that. He takes inspiration from the folk tales, and it doesn't really go back the inspiration, I would say.
And the writing down of the folk tales, I think, took place at the time when this tradition was gradually dying out. Yeah. Due to changes in the lifestyle of people, industrialization, and so on and so forth.
Perhaps also a rise in literacy. maybe. So people were actually able to read inwardly by themselves, and the spreading of the books and things like that. Yeah. So should we move on to our list here? There's a question from Deborah Cresswell. What form of Christianity did Hans Christian Andersen follow? How would it compare to, say, the Church of England or other modern Western Protestantism?
I think we've kind of answered that.
Because it was more or less straightforward Lutheran Protestantism. That he was following.
That would be the Christianity of the state church, and Andersen's upbringing would be an upbringing as a Lutheran Protestant. But then he had this openness and curiosity about religion, and these, as already mentioned, these quite unconventional and unorthodox ideas were in circulation. And it's this kind of small elaborations on Lutheran doctrine somehow. You could also perhaps say, maybe it's of interest to note that as some sort of personal thing, I think he also really saw he really incorporated nature somehow into this Christian view. He several times he writes in his books that he reads the Bible and he reads nature, and that is where he feels this Christianity the most. So there is this interesting creation as well, and not, you could say, religion as a purely ideological thing, or as a purely as a thing that goes on merely in your mind. He enjoys nature a lot and sees in that some kind of affiliation with his beliefs, his religious beliefs. And there's also, of course, a creational theology within Christianity. But Andersen, of course, is also influenced by Romanticism. So it's very complex.
And he's very open. You could also note that he's also very open towards other religions. At some point he writes, that is in A Poet's Bazaar, he writes that he has the utmost respect for any religious person's attempt to approach his or her God. And that is more or less everybody in the world. All religious people in the world fascinates him, and he has a very profound respect for other ways of seeing things.
I think Andersen's main interest perhaps is the question, what is the true spirit of Christianity and of Christian love? And the answer to that question might kind of transcend Christianity, might involve, or such a spirit could be found in other religions. And it would certainly go across the divide between, for example, Catholicism and Protestantism.
He writes about Catholicism that he has a lot of respect for Catholicism, but the actual practice of the rituals, for him, it is taking his mind off what is of this Andacht. It's taking him out of this pious mood, and it's directing his attention to earthly things, and that is what he doesn't like about the Catholic rituals.
And that could be interpreted as a Protestant view. But it isn't necessarily.
No. It could just be a personal remark he made.
So the next question is from Brian Baker. Andersen lived at a time of radical reevaluations of Christian doctrine. Yes, that's true, and we've covered that, I think. And biblical study. Demythologization was one of these. Do we know whether he was influenced by these? Again, the brief answer would be yes, he was. And he wrote an entire novel in order to address this debate. It's a novel called To Be or Not to Be, from 1950 something.
I can't
maybe 51, maybe. But he was, again, you talked about this crisis, Torsten, and I talked about all these ideas circulating. And this demythologization of Christian belief was part of what was up in the air.
Yeah.
And Andersen was very interested in this and at times provoked by this. And he devoted an entire novel in order to discuss it.
Discussing the relationship between the natural sciences and religion, among other things, and quoting to some extent the German philosopher Feuerbach, who was probably one of the, I'm not very well read in Feuerbach, but I believe he was one of the earliest philosophers to question religion and Christianity in particular.
And then within hermeneutics, the philological study of the Bible, it's also important that philologists were beginning to read the Bible not as the pristine word of God, but as a textual document from, some couple of thousand years ago, almost. So this is a very different way of reading and understanding the Bible. And that was also important.
But he was very heavily influenced by this and very well read as well. The next question is from Sue Whitehead. She writes, I won't be attending live as it is 4:30 in the morning in my time zone. I will check it out after. I would like to hear more about Hans Christian Andersen's life. I was not aware as a child of the strong religious themes, and I wonder if they just passed over my head, or if the stories that I knew best, The Emperor's New Clothes, The Princess and the Pea, and The Ugly Duckling, were just cut from another cloth. And I think it's safe to say that they are. I think so too. And there are several of his fairy tales that don't have these overt Christian themes. And perhaps those will also be the ones that in time will prove to survive, because perhaps some of them that are very, very into discussing, debating Christian themes, maybe they will be outdated.
I think the stories mentioned belong at present to, you could say, the international Andersen canon, which consists of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 stories or something like that. And The Little Mermaid would be amongst them. And you don't have to read it with a view to the Christian allegorical elements. But quite a few of the others, they contain no Christian perspective or allegorical elements.
I would also say that among these very canonized, internationally well-known, the Little Mermaid would be the most Christian. It's not that it's Christian, but the one that contains the most about it. But I think that it's also perfectly possible to read it without looking at that.
And I'm not quite sure if the Nightingale belongs to, but I think it's pretty well known also, belongs in a way to this international canon. They really have to look for the Christian allegorical element, which I think is at the end when the Nightingale says to the Emperor, I will come on my own accord. You cannot force me to come, but I will come now and then, and I will sing to you, and I will sing to you about the people that you do not know of in your kingdom. Those you do not normally see, who you're not normally aware of. And you could think about this along the lines of the Old Testament, where the ruler is measured on the basis of how is the orphan and the widow doing. I mean, are you a just ruler? Are you taking care of the widow and the orphan? And if you're not, you're a bad ruler.
But that you really have to...
That's quite well hidden.
It's very well hidden. You really have to look closely to get that out of it, I think. But that is, I think that is true, that that the most well-known, it's the Christian message is quite well hidden, which is also why I think one of the reasons why some of these stories have so easily just crossed the cultural borders into other cultures. So that, for instance, The Little Match Girl is one of the most popular stories in China and things like that. If they were all very clear Christian moral stories, I'm not sure that they would have transcended different cultures that easily.
And we've got a comment from Sheila Ash, and she kind of just approves of
Yes.
the question from Sue, which we've just answered. So I think we should then move on to Margaret Harris. And she writes, "This course has made me wonder how well received Andersen was amongst the ordinary people, and whether they picked up on all his references to religion." It's not so easy to answer this question. I think to begin with, Andersen was received mostly amongst the bourgeois elite. They would read his novels, and then they would buy his volumes of fairy tales in order to read them to their children.
Mm-hmm.
And gradually, this audience would become aware that he didn't write just for children, but with this double articulation.
Yeah.
But I also think his popularity would spread, that he would, or he became in his lifetime, a more and more popular author with a wider audience, and not just an audience amongst the bourgeois elite, but amongst the people.
Yeah, I think so too.
And that was a process, taking place during his life.
He ended up being very well recognized, but it's always very interesting when we talk about ordinary people in this period in time, because the ordinary people in the beginning would probably not know. No, it's always different when you difficult when you talk about romanticism, because you can make it seem like everybody in society was looking at this art and reading these books, and you have to remember that the intellectual bourgeoisie elite might have been, I don't know, a couple of percent of the entire population of society at this point in time. So it was definitely not everybody who was knowing about romanticism. But I do think that you're right, that it might have trickled down the works of Hans Christian Andersen. I also think, I can't remember which, but I think that some of the stories were printed in the newspapers.
Yes.
As well, which would have made them much more accessible.
Certainly.
To a lot more people.
And quite late in his life, he would give readings and perhaps also answer questions about his work in, meetings for workers, laborers, at the kind of workers' union of the day. Yeah, which indicates that he had quite a wide audience towards the end of his life,
especially for the fairy tales.
I think he was very appreciative and happy about that.
Yeah. As to whether people would have picked up on all his references to religion, I definitely believe that they would have.
I think so. We're talking about a Christian culture.
Yeah, a very Christian culture, and religion was widely debated and
amongst the elite.
Yeah, amongst the elite, but in I think in most people's self-understanding, they would be Christians. In To Be or Not to Be, the main character defines himself, I believe, as an atheist, which is quite controversial at that point in time, and which kind of never happened. It was very controversial. So I definitely believe that that this reading community that he wrote for would have picked up on them.
Yeah.
Maybe we should have a look if there is. Don't think we have. I will take the next question from Elizabeth E. then. This question perhaps requires more time than a Q&A session allows, but I would like to see some commentary on Hans Christian Andersen's attitudes towards a woman's place in life and society. He writes sympathetically about young girls, for instance, The Little Mermaid, but I think the witch is a somewhat subversive character, and I wonder whether he's using the witch to make some kind of comment on current attitudes towards women. That is a very big question. I think that if I understand it correctly, then I think that Andersen is definitely interested in the outsider's position. I don't necessarily think that what I mean to say is that calling Hans Christian Andersen a feminist would be pushing the envelope drastically. However, it is a apparent that he has great faith in the capabilities of women, and a lot of his protagonists are female, strong female characters. You have Elisa from the Wild Swans, you have the mermaid, of course, you have Gerda in the Snow Queen, and then in the novels, interestingly, you have a couple of Jewish women in To Be or Not to Be. There is Esther. And I think in the beginning of the book, she actually says, or sometimes in the book, she has this little monologue talking about how wonderful it would be if women had access to the same education as men. So there is definitely this kind of it's there somewhere.
It would be pushing it to say that Andersen was a feminist, but he was no supporter of patriarchal society.
No, definitely not.
No.
And it is usually these, it's interesting why he uses these Jewish women. The other one is called Naomi from Just a Fiddler. And they somehow, given that they are both women and from a different belief, they had this kind of cultural side glance on the Danish society. And they're able to say some things that you wouldn't be able to if you were completely embedded in that society. So I think he uses the female position as some kind of marginal position from you can formulate a critique. That's not possible.
I think that's very precise.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as regards the witch, I think the witch in general is a subversive figure.
Yeah.
And also in The Little Mermaid, but I think she is also a negative character in The Little Mermaid, even though without her craft there would have been no story. But I think she rejoices in her conviction that the mermaid will fail in or on her quest, and she is an evil character.
Yeah. I
So
would say so.
she's not just subversive.
No,
she's also evil. But
yeah,
the witch as such is of course a subversive.
Yeah, and has these can have these trickster qualities. I think
it is the subversive figure in Christian patriarchal culture.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Yeah.
It represents nature. It represents the non-Christian, non-authorized. It represents alternative medicine. It's like everything that's not allowed in Christian patriarchal society.
Right, then there's a question from Alan Brennan. Over Andersen's writing career, is there a discernible development in the themes he explores, or does he just go over the same ground time and time again? And there's one more question, but let's begin with this one.
Yeah.
I think that Andersen will take up new themes, but he will also very persistently deal with the same themes, but not in a way that he just goes over the same ground time and time again.
No.
I think he will take up themes and motives or motifs which are of central interest to him. He will deal with them again, but try to view them from a different perspective. And I think that's very central to his authorship.
Yeah.
Going over the same ground again, but from a different perspective, which is what makes his output so open and questioning as it is. Because there's never just one opinion about an issue. No. There is a series of different perspectives on this.
But this is a thing I believe that's actually quite debated within Andersen scholarly research, if there is some sort of development and what that development might consist of.
I think he becomes I think there is a development in the way he's writing, in that he I mean, simply formally speaking, he becomes more experimenting.
Yeah.
Especially in his works of short prose fiction.
Yeah.
So there is an aesthetic development. He is trying to develop new ways of writing short prose fiction.
Yeah. But don't you think that becomes an increasingly that he becomes increasingly aware of that project, and it becomes somehow more and more precise that he is doing that during his authorship. I mean, treading new ground, finding some new form of literature, some new form of. I think that becomes more and more deliberate somehow.
Yeah, certainly.
Whereas in the way I see it, I think that in the beginning of his authorship, he's also very interested of the question of art and literature's role and what literature should do. But then he's discussing it in relation to German idealistic philosophy and romantic dogma. Whereas at the end, towards the end of his authorship, he's looking more forward into modernity and in getting more influenced by natural science. And I think it's somehow the developments in his authorship is also to some extent linked with the developments in the time he is living in, all the things that happened during that century where he's
you're right.
living in. Yeah. So it's also moved on by current events.
And then the second part of Alan's question. Most of us will have only a handful of fairy stories that immediately come to mind. What do you think makes a great and memorable fairy story? That's a big one.
A very big question. And I actually, when I just read these questions, I was actually struggling a bit with trying to think about what I think it makes a great and memorable fairy story.
Yeah, because we've got the kind of fairy story based on the folktale mold, which Andersen is writing a lot of them, and then we've got the broad concept of a fairy story.
Yeah.
And great epics like Lord of the Rings, the Harry Potter septology, isn't it?
Yeah. Where it actually almost where there's a blur between fairy tale proper and fantasy, different kinds of fantasy genres.
Yeah.
Also within Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, there are subgenres, and as you say, there are things that are very close to the folk tale. Then there are some of his tales that are very far away from it. So I don't think I can put up some formal criteria of what makes a great and memorable fairy story, because that's a very subjective opinion. So I could say, what, as we do on the course, what are the formal requirements for a folk tale, or what are the structures of that? So I don't really know. I'm really fond of the subgenre of his artistic production that's called the object fairy tales. I'm very sorry, but none of those are included in the MOOC, so we're not going through any of that.
We'll have to do another one.
Yeah, we'll have to do one about those, because that's a very delightful part of his authorship. These object of fairy tales of things, which include The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep, which is one of, I like that very much, because I think that is very concise, it's funny, it's short and to the point. And I like that about a fairy tale. I don't know about you.
Yeah, because I mean, if you talk about Tolkien or Rowling, you talk about, you know, creating a memorable universe. So the great epics, they create a universe.
Yeah.
And I mean, I started reading Harry Potter aloud to my son, and gradually he became a reader in his own right. So the last couple of Potter books he read for himself.
Yeah.
But I think they've got the elements of a great universe and humor and ambiguous characters.
Yeah.
So if we talk about these big epics, I think the Potter septology has got some of the elements that I enjoyed while reading aloud.
Yeah.
As an adult.
Yeah, I think that's what maybe that's a good way of talking about it, because I was also a great Harry Potter fan when I was young, and I still am. I think maybe the creativity, the where where you get the impression that the writer has some kind of, I don't know, imaginary excess, or there is something really creative and original. I think that's and unusual and surprising. I also really like Alice in Wonderland for the same reasons. It's so surprising. You never know what's going to happen on the next page, and also yeah, just the words and the language is also very surprising and very quirky. And I think but in general, when it comes to literature, I really like the balance between the content, which has to be really creative and original, and then the language, which has to match the content.
Alice in Wonderland is much closer to Andersen.
Yeah.
When it comes to what goes on in the language, simply.
Yeah.
And kind of taking language at its word.
Yeah. Yeah.
From having a dish like mock turtle soup, and then suddenly having a character like a mock turtle.
Yeah.
That's also the way Andersen's imagination is working.
Yeah, and I love that. I love play on words and linguistic artistry. So whenever that's at play, I'm there. I hope that was enough of an answer, because it's a very personal thing. What do you think makes a memorable fairy story? Yeah. Maybe we should move on to Richard Dilwyn Edwards' question. What are the main features of Andersen's perspective on life? Are they discernible in his fairy tales?
I think I would point to this perspectivism, you could almost say, again. Andersen's perspective on life is looking for perspectives on life.
Yeah.
Seeing things from different angles, trying to understand them from different angles.
Yes.
And then perhaps an idea about justice.
Yes, there is some kind
religiously, politically.
Yeah.
And I think this idea, I mean, an ideal about a justice which is maybe never obtained.
Yeah.
Or maybe which is obtained sometimes and other times not. I think that is discernible.
Yeah, it's definitely not this view that justice will always prevail, because it doesn't.
No,
but
and we might not know what it is.
Yeah,
but it's still an ideal to strive for, even if we don't know what it is.
Yeah. One of the I've recently talked to a group of Italian people about the messages, the overall messages of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and they also mentioned, because some of them were talking about, oh well, the overall message is that if you try hard, you will always succeed. But some of the others said, but they don't always succeed, these people. So it's also there's also a lot of fairy tales about how the world is unjust and how things happen at chance that you just have to react upon and that you can't control, that a lot of things are out of your control. So it's not just this traditional Bildungs way of thinking that if you just react properly, or if you just have a plan for yourself, then you will make it in the end. This is a world of chance, and where justice doesn't always prevail. And I think that's very discernible in the texts.
Yeah. The next, we've got a couple of questions from Sheila Ash.
Yes.
Since Andersen wrote his stories, has there been a fashion for some stories over others? And if so, does this correlate with socio-political historical events? And I think we could say yes, that this is the case. I think, for example, China and Russia being good examples, where the socio-political climate certainly changed historically.
Yeah.
And that meant that certain stories, tales of Andersen would move into focus.
Yeah.
Because they could be used within a political agenda, for example. So that's just one example.
Yeah. Yeah. I think especially The Emperor's New Clothes and The Little Match Girl I have been used politically, because they can be read as anti-elitist and anti-capitalist stories, and they have been by these political systems. So they have been. I'm not sure about here in Denmark if they've been very closely linked with socio-political historical events. I don't think so.
No.
No. And it has, I think, more or less, since they were written, been these same 8-10 stories that are very well known, and it is more or less the same that are very well known internationally, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't think that they are linked to their popularity as any correlation with social, political, historical events in Denmark.
No. And then Sheila asks, please could the educators say something about how the fairy tale has changed since Andersen?
Mm-hmm.
I think when we discussed Alan's question, maybe we have discussed this a bit, but it's again the problem. What are we talking about when we're talking about a fairy tale?
Yeah.
But I think you can say that modern writers writing for adults and other writers writing for children take up or have taken up the genre of the fairy tale,
Mm-hmm.
of the folktale mold, in order to write stories with more active female protagonists, for example. So I think it's a genre which will always be taken up again.
Yeah.
And perhaps to reflect on socio-political matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's a genre that lends itself very easily to this kind of discrete criticism. So it can be used in that way. But I think, yeah, it's a difficult question, because it's difficult to say how the fairy tale has changed since Hans Christian Andersen, because our point of view, I think, is more how has it changed with Hans Christian Andersen? What did he do with the fairy tale genre? I don't know. What you could say right now is that it seems to be, right at the moment in popular culture, it seems that it's more the Gothic aspect of 19th century literature that is trending. So it's not the world of princesses and heroes and things like that. It's more the world of vampires and zombies and things like that that's trending, which also has its roots back in this kind of this period of time in literary history.
Yeah.
And then again, I think it's difficult for modern day writers to write. The challenges that the fairy tale poses is that traditionally its characters are very flat. They're very two-dimensional. They have these functions in the text, where I think a modern day writer would tend to build up some kind of psychology on the character, or invest it with some kind of motives for doing what he or she does. Whereas in the traditional fairy tale and folktale universe, it's just given that they have to do this because they function in a certain way.
You might say that Andersen was a kind of pioneer in taking up, you know, the flat characters, the basic story elements, and then doing something. Yeah. Making more round characters like the Little Mermaid. Yeah. And simply twisting and turning the basic elements. Yeah. And when modern writers write fairy tales like the ones I spoke of, they are in a way doing what Andersen was doing, and maybe he facilitated the fact that it is possible to work in that way with the genre. Yeah, maybe, and expand it. Then Emma Robertson is asking, thanks for the course, I'm loving it. This is a cheesy question, but what is each of your absolute favorite Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, and what have you interpreted in them that moves you personally so much? That's a big one. Very big question, because I'm finding it really difficult to decide on just one story. I think I've got 4 favorites. The story of a mother, because it's a very moving story. And because it's so condensed, it's so brilliant in its condensation.
Yeah.
I think it's an absolute masterpiece.
Yeah.
The Snow Queen, for being such a self-reflecting, sophisticated celebration of innocence. I simply love that. And the way it also meditates upon storytelling.
Yeah.
And then the shadow, the sheer brilliance of the way it's written, and for its political and cultural diagnosis.
Yeah.
And that's also an absolute masterpiece.
Yeah.
Hereby recommended.
Yeah, yeah.
And then on to Toothache.
Yeah.
As Andersen's artistic testament.
Yeah.
And also consisting of, I mean, it's all paradox. The whole thing consists of very, very clever paradoxes.
Yeah. And it's hilarious. It's hilariously written.
It's a brilliant move.
Yeah.
And a brilliant testament.
Yeah. I agree upon, especially they're all very, very great stories, but I particularly, I've always been very, very moved by the story of a mother, because I think it is incredibly moving, heartbreaking, and beautifully written. And I also, The Little Mermaid has also always been a personal favorite of mine, because I really love the universe that he creates is so original and so interesting. I also like, as I said, the object tales, these very short tales about objects, because I think he's very clever when he animates these objects. And a lesser known one, and I can't really explain why, but I remember I thought when I was a teenager, I thought I'd read all of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales. And then one day in the radio, I heard a recording of Karen Blixen reading aloud The Teapot, which moved me incredibly, because it's I think it's very little known, very short fairy tale about a teapot that gets broken and is about to be thrown out, but then she is converted into a flower pot. And that is just a really, I think, I've always been incredibly moved by that. There's especially a sentence where it says it's blessed to lose yourself in other people. And I think that is a really, really moving and beautiful message of this story. And then if you really want value for your money, I think you should definitely read The Muse of the New Century, because I think that the pace of that text and the prose of that text is just amazing. I think it's a really, really good text. I also believe that Andersen actually regarded it as one of his best works. And I can understand why, but there's so much to choose from. I also really like, because of the length of it, I like the Wild Swans, because I think that is also a very beautiful long text.
Yes. Let's move on to next question is from Fabian Ellis. Was the move away from traditional fairy tales to the more modern writing by Andersen a personal choice, or was it dictated by the socio-political climate he lived through? Or could that be one and the same thing? We've kind of been around this, I think. We've addressed this. And you talked about kind of the way he developed as a writer.
Yeah.
As also reflecting how the 19th century developed.
Yeah.
From Romanticism at the outset and facing early modernity at the end of it.
Yeah.
And I think that you were absolutely right that in this way the development of the 19th century is reflected in the development of Andersen as a writer.
Yeah.
And I think that answers this question.
Yeah. You could just put in there that it wasn't necessarily dictated by the artistic climate he lived in, because it says the socio-political climate here. But we could mention that it was when he started writing fairy tales, they weren't just seen as, they were actually seen as quite problematic, because what he did with them, not necessarily that he deviated from the traditional forms, but especially the tone of voice that he employs in the fairy tales. It was seen as too close to the level of children, and that was in conflict with the pedagogical values at that time. So when you were talking to children through children's literature at this time, you would have to be very pedagogical. You would have to instruct children in what to do, and not present them with these kind of unresolved dilemmas that were actually narrated in a childish way. So when there was a collection of fairy tales to be published, not long after Andersen started writing fairy tales, he only got one accepted into this collection of fairy tales, because the other were simply viewed as unpedagogical, because they were too childish in their narration.
And too subversive in their content.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe it must have been somewhat of a personal choice, but then of course it grew in popularity, and by the end of his career it was in very high regard.
Mm-hmm.
The next question is from Nink Simonson. Regarding the story of a mother, this is a copy of my posting to 5.4. Could I be right? If so, it makes a great difference as to how the tale can be interpreted. And here is the post. I had not read into the story that the two flowers at the end could not be the child of the mother, and she had thus been cheated by death. I interpreted it as death having the power to transform the essence of the sickly plant into another form, and so taking the analogy back to the child, it has left its earthly body and has entered into a state of suspension, a kind of purgatory, until the final decision as to the destination of its soul can be decided. But death is cruel and will give no hint as to God's will, no matter how pitifully the plea is made. The decision is literally in the lap of the gods.
Yeah, that's a deep question. Of course, as this very condensed piece of literature on narrating, the end is, of course, or this aspect of the story is open to interpretation. And your interpretation, Nick, is certainly possible. And this kind of purgatory could be linked to the idea about the afterlife of the in-between state. So it's a perfectly possible and relevant understanding of this part of or element of the story.
Yeah.
The understanding I've suggested is an understanding where the way that death tricks the mother, he in a way tricks her by means of a piece of fiction. The lie I interpret as a piece of fiction, which then is kind of an argument that lying, making fiction, can have a kind of healing power. So that's two different interpretations, and you could come up with many more.
Yeah,
I guess.
definitely.
In my reading, death isn't cruel. Then he's rather a kind of spiritual helper.
Yeah.
And my suggestion is also that he's molded on Tiresias from Oedipus Rex, the blind seer who makes Oedipus realize what Oedipus has done. Like death makes the mother realize that she's been revolting against the will of God.
Yeah.
And again, if you read it this way, you read it as a Christian allegory, and you don't have to read it that way.
No.
So I think this is just a good example.
Yeah.
How really great pieces of literature are open to many different interpretations.
Yeah.
And that's part of their power, so to speak.
Definitely. The only thing that you can say is that you have to be very attentive to the exact wording of the text. And I know for a fact that a lot of people have the tendency, including myself, to just read over this and not see this kind of small displacing in the text, that he's not exactly that it could not be the child of the mother that that she's standing with here. So you have to be very attentive to the wording.
Yeah, and that's our job.
Yeah,
that at least.
Then, oh, should I? Mary Davy asks, could you explain the difference between Hans Christian Andersen's use of the fairy tale as a vehicle for what he wants to say, as opposed to other enthusiasts, such as the brothers Grimm?
I mean, that's the difference between having someone tell you a folk tale, writing it down, maybe improving a little bit of a language, maybe sanitizing a bit, and then inventing stories of your own invention. Yeah, which Andersen is doing. I mean, he could do something that the Grimm brothers could never do because they were not inventors of stories.
No, I think that must be the main difference between them. That I think that the brothers Grimm considered themselves collectors rather than creators of fairy tales, even though that they might have sanitized and left out a couple of things. I think that was definitely their own self-understanding that they were collecting these because it was a tradition that was sort of dying out at this point. So they needed to gather in all these stories.
They weren't looking for a vehicle. They wanted to preserve a tradition.
Yes, exactly. Whereas Andersen clearly wanted to get some of his own messages across and deliberate on his own, and also incorporate into these fairy tales the theme of what is art and literature and what is its role in society.
That's a big theme.
That's a big theme, and that's a meta-poetical question that you won't find in traditional folk tales. If you find, for instance, a musical instrument, it will usually have this allegorical meaning that of expressing feelings or something like that. It's not a question of literature in its own right. And that's a uniquely Hans Christian Andersen trait, asking this meta question in literature, what is literature?
Yeah. Then one more question from Mary Davy. Were readers at the time more in tune with seeing and understanding the allegory behind the narrative? Have we lost something as readers since? Or is it the rise of popular fiction that has had an effect on our expectations as readers? I guess this is also a question of both and, I think. I mean, Andersen draws upon biblical narratives, Christian understanding of life, things which are not obvious to all modern readers. So of course, as modern readers, unless you study things like we do, you don't necessarily have the references that you need in order to fathom the full depth of allegories like some of Andersen's stories. Doesn't mean you cannot read them, enjoy them, and learn from them. But of course, you have to have a certain competence that people had at the time, because it was natural to have it at the time. But culture has changed.
I agree. The thing about these fairy tales especially is that they can always just be taken at face value. You can just read them and appreciate the plot and what happens and the characters and the humoristic things that go on. But then if you know about the references, you can always go deeper into the fairy tale. So I think that is completely correct. And then again, that is also perhaps why the fairy tales in particular can be so universal, that they can always be somehow taken at face value, and they can be read all over the world and be appreciated for what just happens on the surface of them. Whereas if you read some of the novels, they are so deeply embedded, as you mentioned, to be or not to be is very difficult to understand if you have no knowledge of Denmark in the 19th century and the debates that were going on at that time. Then a lot of it will be really, really foreign to you, and you won't understand what is going on.
And we've got one question.
Oh, yes.
Has arrived.
From the live chat. Alan Branner is asking, Alan Garner comments in the introduction to his collection of British folk tales that a retelling should sing rather than just translate. Is part of Andersen's attraction that they sing?
I think this is exactly what he's doing. I think,
yeah,
a wonderful question.
Yeah,
and you could just say yes. Once he kind of begins with the tinderbox, he just starts singing.
Yeah,
and he doesn't stop.
No, and he changes, and yeah, he really does. I think that is a very poetic way of describing his his methods.
Yeah. So I think we should just enjoy that image.
You could just as a curiosity, Andersen actually often refers to his own poetic practice with a lot of other allegories than just describing it as writing. A lot of the time he draws on examples from painting. When he describes something, he will usually write, let me paint you a picture of this, or let me paint you a sketch of this. And he also refers to poetry sometimes as singing. He has there are very many overlaps between the different practices, the different artistic practices somehow in his works and in his view on art. He also had as a young boy, he had a very nice singing voice, and he has actually tried out a couple of the different artistic genres and disciplines.
Yeah. Then we have got a question from Vitaly Mironenko. Although we've got much analysis of the Little Mermaid and interpretations of many things and facts, I didn't find the professional explanation of cutting the Little Mermaid's tongue off by the sea witch. Here is a quote. There it is, the witch said, and cut the Little Mermaid's tongue off. She was mute now, unable to either sing or speak. If you find my question worth answering, please tell your interpretation of the cutting off of the mermaid's tongue. Is there any connection to thoughts from the Epistle of James? The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our life and is set on fire by hell. Thanks. It's another profound question. Just to discuss the motif of the cutting off of the tongue in the Little Mermaid. Again, it can be interpreted in many ways. I liked in one of the discussion threads, someone, I can't remember who, I'm sorry, but someone pointed out that the mermaid is completely negated as a mermaid. Because the two main features of a mermaid, that's the singing voice of the siren, and it's the tail.
That's a good point.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the Little Mermaid loses both, and she has not yet become a human.
Yeah.
So this really emphasizes her, also the kind of limbo state she is in when she is on land, trying to win the love of the prince.
That's an interesting interpretation, because that means that that emphasizes that in-between state before the ending in-between state. So she's from the moment she is transformed, she's in between, and she never ends up anywhere, you could say.
Yeah.
This continues out throughout the story.
And when she finally can feel tears in her eyes, she's become a daughter of the air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know about the reference to the Epistle of James, but I think it is interesting, because this might even more be a reference to the antique function of mermaids and the Odyssey. And
so I could add something about the Epistle of James.
Yeah.
Not related to Andersen, but this epistle is about being grateful for everything that God sends us from above. And then it's a critique of, our human tongue, the way that we can always use language and do use language in order to quarrel and defile and so on.
Yeah.
And I don't really think that's a central motif in The Little Mermaid.
No.
But the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, he also wrote throughout his time as an author and writer, he wrote A Building Discourses, and he wrote several on the letter of James. And his last one, while he was doing or launching his, very, very harsh attack on the Danish state church, while he was in the midst of this attack, he published his last A Building Discourse, it's called The Unchangeability of God, and it's on the letter of James. So yeah. So if you can look up Kierkegaard's last A Building Discourse, The Unchangeability of God, you can find a Danish writer from the time of Andersen writing upon the Epistle of James.
Yeah. Interesting. But to return to the tongue cutting, then I think that it's of course done in the text to disable her, to make her unable to recount her own story, and that's a very powerful thing to do if you see it in relation to, as you've pointed out, if you see it in connection with the Snow Queen, then Gerda's the best tool she has to achieve what she wants is the ability to recount her own story again and again and again. And
that's a very nice poignant contrast to The Little Mermaid. Yeah,
exactly, because that's exactly what she's being denied, and who knows what the outcome of the story might have been if she was able to recount her own story.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So the next question is from Sarah Pottle. She writes, "The most intriguing thing I noticed when studying The Little Mermaid was how much closer the Disney version fitted both the home away home structure and the actantial model than Andersen's original. Do you know if the animators, storyboard designers, and directors were aware of this model, or was it an instinctual approach to storytelling due to these narrative structures being as old as legend itself?" We'll take the next question afterwards, I think.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think if you're a professional script writer, if you've kind of been educated professionally in order to be a writer of scripts, you will know about the attentional model and other models that have to do with dramatization, storytelling, and so on.
Yeah, it's
so the professional people writing scripts for Disney, they probably do know about the attentional model.
I'm quite sure they do, because it's such a basic tool when you want to see how a plot is built, how a development of a storyline, how it is constructed.
Yeah.
So
and at the same time, we are dealing with narrative structures that are as old as legend itself.
Yes, and so maybe it comes to them quite to these Disney producers quite instinctually.
Yeah, we do not know.
No, we have no idea. But as it happens, there actually is a large exhibition at our museum here in Odense at the moment called it's a Disney exhibition called The Art of Storytelling. And there is actually an interesting little piece that is featured, a little memo, I believe, from a meeting. I can't remember if it's in the 30s or from the 40s, where they're discussing on making an animation of the Steadfast Tin Soldier. And as we know, it ends up with him being thrown into the stove, and the ballerina also is lifted by a gust of wind, and she burns in the stove with him. And they write in that memo, of course, we'll have to change the ending. So it doesn't say why, it's like everybody just agrees upon that this is not a Disney ending, we can't make it like this, so of course we'll have to change it some way or other to make it more Disney-like. So there are also, I think, some Disney dogma that I don't know if the that just kick in when you're dealing with
yeah, but it's, of course, it's I think it's very well formulated, this question, and it is very interesting that these basic fairy tale structures are operative in most Disney productions.
Yes.
And this means that they reflect a kind of universality,
yeah,
that Disney want to preserve, and which is still required in modern storytelling.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And it highlights the also very interesting fact that Andersen completely deviates from
it really does
from that kind of universality.
Yeah.
And then he arrives at other kinds of universality.
Yeah.
It appears.
But you could maybe say that Disney, they start out with Snow White, which fits the actantial model somehow perfectly, and then they just seem to stick to it. So it just they keep it throughout the 20th century at least.
And maybe it's also essential to at least one idea about what a fairy tale should be like.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I think what most people think when they hear fairy tale, they also think about the rhetorical endings and the beginnings and endings, once upon a time and happily ever after. And that is how a fairy tale should start and end, according to a lot of people, I think, a proper fairy tale.
And then there is the second part of
Yes.
Sarah's question. If the fairy tales Andersen and the Grimm brothers retold, reinvented and artistically developed were originally folklore and fairy tales told by women to other women and children, did these original tales also fit the actantial model? Would these earlier tales retain the same motifs, especially in relation to their depiction of women?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, because to my knowledge, we don't know a lot about oral fairy tale or folktale storytelling, given that it was oral. We only know it from what has been written down afterwards.
Yeah. I think one place to start would be what Andersen has told about his early childhood. That his mother would take him along to wherever she was working, and she would be working, I think, mostly amongst other women.
Yeah.
And fairy tales would be told.
Yeah.
So part of Andersen's initiation to the fairy tale genre was listening to women telling fairy tales.
Yeah. But we don't know much.
But I don't think it's a tradition which has only been transmitted by women.
No, I don't, and I don't think
historically.
And I don't think that it has only been transmitted by women to children necessarily. This was also a way of entertaining each other in the evening, and adults as well. So
certainly
everybody would be listening to the storyteller when someone was telling a story. We don't necessarily know if the women have been portrayed differently in the traditional folk tales. There is not necessarily anything that suggests that the role of women would have been very different than the one they have in the ones that are recorded by the Grimm brothers. But what I think that people are suspecting is that when these tales were told in the medieval times, they would have been, it's safe to say that they would probably have been more vulgar, more crude, more subversive. And when they are written down by the Grimm brothers, among others, they have weeded out the most subversive, most unchristian elements. They have probably also demonized the witches a bit further that appear. But that is actually more or less speculation, I think. We can't really know what function women would have had.
But I think one thing one could add is that you can certainly find original folk tales which do also deviate from the actantial model.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So that is not something that or which begins with Andersen?
No,
No.
no, 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 definitely no, because of course the actantial model is a structural structuralist model that is imposed somehow or drawn out of some very general structures. Like if you took all of these fairy tales and put them on top of each other, you would see this more or less picture of them. But there are a lot of them also because they were, when told, they would be very individually told by each storyteller. So one storyteller would emphasize other things, and yeah, what we
maybe you could also say that the folk tales, they do not represent necessarily a patriarchal social order.
No,
they'll probably reflect, you could say, the kind of historical division of labor between the sexes.
Yeah,
but that's something different.
Yeah. But I think it's safe to say that because given that this was the pastime of probably the lowest of the classes in society, they would have had some kind of carnivalesque aspect to them. That is, there might have been some kind of subversion, some kind of class subversion, where you would find that the elite would be ridiculed.
Yeah, and in some folk tales you also find critique of the church as an institution.
Yeah, yeah. It's usually, especially if you read the ones from, I think we have quite some material from the Netherlands, from the medieval times, and the entire clerical class is completely corrupt and ridiculous and power hungry and greedy when you read those. So there is definitely this was somehow some kind of vent, a way for the lower classes to get some kind of outlet and ridicule their the classes that were above them.
Absolutely. Well, I think we are more or less through.
Yes.
The questions, and thank you. It was very enjoyable to answer them and discuss them. And we are almost right on time.
Yes.
So thank you for now.
Thank you very much.
From both of us to all of you.
Yes. Thank you very much, and we hope you will enjoy the rest of the course. Thank you.